Shabbat Shalom. Thank you to Shari and Marvin Chinitz for generously sponsoring this week's Dvar Torah in memory of Shari's beloved mother, Edith Kuttner. Jacob and his family moved to Egypt with trepidation and anticipation, with hearts full of hope for a little stability and a sweet reunion after so many years of famine and grief. They moved from their homeland into a new country full of promise of food and water and lush grazing lands, a son and brother that they had lost. But generations later, the Israelites have been enslaved for a very long time. They're in this strange country and they no longer remember the famine or the promises that brought them there. They no longer look back at what things used to be, and they can't figure out how to look forward to a future where things might be different. They are subjected to harsh labor, work that is so physically taxing that just going through the motions of getting through the day is all they can ask of their bodies. Work that is so emotionally and spiritually arduous that they have forgotten how to lift their eyes to the horizon. They've forgotten how to hope. In this hazy, exhausting existence, Moshe, an Israelite turned Egyptian turned Israelite, Moshe, a stranger, wandered out of the wilderness and tried to give them a message. He tried to tell them that he had had a conversation with God, with their God, the God of their ancestors who had brought them to Egypt in the first place. He told them that this God is incredible and powerful and cared about them. He told them that he, along with God, were going to save them from this life that they could barely call living. Vayidaber Moshe ken el bnei Yisrael velo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach ume'avodah kasha. But when Moshe told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses. Their spirits were low from their hard labor. Literally, mikotzer ruach means shortness of spirit. It conveys an intolerable depth of anguish, a lack of energy, of strength. Rashi teaches that another way to understand mikotzer ruach is a shortness of breath, because when someone is suffering this way, it's hard to breathe. The air comes in short gasps, and a person can't take full breaths needed to inflate the lungs and bring rejuvenation. Nechama Leibowitz explains that they were so downtrodden, there was no trace of faith or trust, not even misgiving or even argument and opposition. In their oppression, they wouldn't listen. They couldn't hear the message of impending release, couldn't even tune into the possibility of freedom or protest the improbability of redemption. Of course, if they couldn't breathe, couldn't even pick their heads up, how could they be expected to listen? How could there be room in their lungs and in their hearts for hope? The Sfat Emet describes this as a time of exile of language, a time when they couldn't hear words of consolation, could barely even speak from lack of breath and spirit. Moshe could talk as much as he wanted to, but the people couldn't internalize it. They couldn't listen to descriptions of the future because they could not describe the present. When God revealed to Moshe that God is prepared to fulfill God's covenant with our ancestors, God said, "Vegam ani shamati et na'akat b'nei Yisrael, asher Mitzrayim ma'avdim otam." I have now heard the moaning of the children of Israel who have been enslaved by the Egyptians. God tells Moshe, these people are so burdened. Their experience is so unendurable that when they call out to me, they merely moan. Their sounds reach me as a wordless groan. But the sounds did reach me. I heard the voices of these suffering Israelites. God could hear them even when they couldn't breathe. Even without words, with barely any breath, the people managed to cry. Even silently, the people managed to pray. And even without syllables, God heard and received their messages. The Israelites couldn't process the news of hope in the depths of their pain, but God was able to grasp their suffering and respond to it. God heard the questions they didn't know how to articulate and acted on it. In God's simple statement to Moshe, I have heard their cries, and I am going to live up to my covenant, Moshe learned the importance of listening to the sounds of unspoken pain. When God told Moshe to lead the people, Rashi explains that God actually said to lead them gently, so that when Moses spoke to the Israelites and they couldn't hear him, he looked underneath the surface of their silence and he saw their hardship. He observed their quiet and understood that it was not about him. He understood that it was not about God. They did not hear because they simply could not breathe. They were too short of spirit. As you know, this past spring, I was ordained as a rabbi, and it was a moment I had spent a lot of time imagining. I anticipated celebrating this transition from student to rabbi with my classmates, my beloved teachers. Many family members and friends planned to be there to celebrate with me. And when the time came, I was sitting in front of my computer and looking into the camera. I saw myself on the screen. I saw my classmates on the screen. I saw my teachers on the screen. I saw my deans announce that I would now be known as rabbi, but I didn't hear them. Couldn't process the words. I couldn't form the thoughts that would allow me to integrate this information, to accept this change that was happening in front of me. It was happening to me. Some of my inability to hear what was happening was probably a natural consequence of a transition of identity. I was a student for 5 years, and I had spent a long time thinking about it before that. And now, almost abruptly, I was a rabbi. After years of putting one foot in front of the other, of writing papers and living in a world of theory, I couldn't integrate this message that the change I had been waiting for was here. But I also couldn't hear it because I was suffering. My classmates were suffering, everyone around us was suffering, and we couldn't even be together in the same space to suffer alongside each other. Not even 3 months into this pandemic, we were in an exile of language too. At this point, we barely understood what was happening with the virus. We weren't yet fluent in the language of Zoom, and we didn't know how to have meaningful rituals on a computer. I couldn't hear, we couldn't hear, because we didn't have the words. Like the Israelites, I couldn't listen to descriptions of the future because I could not grasp the contours of the present. We couldn't hear because we couldn't breathe. We are still suffering from kotzer ruach, from shortness of spirit, from lack of breath. It is so hard to breathe. So hard to track the days of the week, to grasp at the straws of sanity as we try to remember what life was like before and what life might be like again, kept inside and apart from fear of a deadly respiratory illness. The pressure on our chests is a heavy burden. It's so hard to breathe. When we heard the vaccine was being released, there was this moment of awe at the marvels of science, the possibilities of relief, of hope. We were just barely able to breathe a little deeper. But then the distribution of the vaccines became so fraught and complicated. Some of the prioritized groups made sense and were vaccinated quickly, but so many who are particularly vulnerable to COVID were told they would need to wait, and no one was sure until when. And then this week, the categories expanded and new people became eligible, only to spend hours trying to fill out forms or depending on other people to help them with the technology, or finally figuring out how to make an appointment only to get one months away, or to then have it canceled on them not long after they made it. And then there are still so many waiting to sign up, waiting to learn when it will even be their turn, when they can start counting down the days until they might feel just a little bit safer leaving their house for the first time since March. Even as we feel relief and celebrate those who were able to receive a dose or even 2 of the vaccine, it became hard to breathe again. Moshe tried to tell the people there was hope on the horizon, that one day there would be another life for them, a time when they could no longer exile from language and oxygen, but they couldn't hear him. It's hard to hear the sound of hope when you can't even hear the whispers of your own breath. The scholar Aviva Zornberg notes that the Israelites were caught in a double bind. They couldn't receive Moshe's message because they weren't ready, but they couldn't possibly become ready while they were still inside of their crisis. She explains that God, hearing their cries, God's revelation to Moshe, shows us an answer. Redemption will have to grow out of unreadiness, trauma, and discontinuity, she writes. When God heard the wordless groans of the Israelites, When Moshe understood the pain beneath the surface of their silence, they demonstrated that the wheels would still be set in motion for redemption, even though the Israelites were still in it, still in the mentality of slavery, still unprepared to accept the offers of hope. We're still a little unsure of what lies ahead, and we've barely begun the healing from what already was, from what currently is. We are like the Israelites in that we are still living our trauma. We are in it. But we are also not like the Israelites, because the sounds of Moshe's words of hope have started to pierce our consciousness. We can hear them. Even in our shortness of breath, we can feel the waters of the Sea of Reeds lapping at our feet as we prepare to cross into freedom. We haven't waded in yet. We haven't found the dry land needed to fully cross the sea, but we are closer. We haven't reclaimed our words or figured out how to reshape our lives on the other side, but the sensation of what it's like to breathe is tickling our throats. We're starting to remember. Mitzrayim, Egypt, is known as the place of narrowness. It's a place of being squeezed tight. It's hard to breathe in those types of places. A few chapters ahead, though, when the Israelites do cross the sea, the world expands. The Israelites take a deep, collective breath, and they sing. Maybe we can find the faith that our own gasped prayers are reaching a listening God. Maybe we can lead and be led gently as Moshe led the Israelites. And soon, God willing, we will plant our feet on the dry land of redemption. We will take our own deep breaths, and together, as a community, we'll sing. Shabbat Shalom.